community development, technical assistance and training, research and information, and policy formulation to enable solutions for rural communities. Today's webinar is Rural Housing in the Fiscal Year 2023 White House Budget. The White House released its Fiscal Year 2023 budget on Monday, March 28th, beginning the process that will determine federal program funding for the year. You will hear from HAC's policy staff and learn about rural housing and community facilities highlights for both the USDA and HUD sections of the budget. I would like to introduce today's speakers. Jonathan Harwitz is the Director of Policy at the Housing Assistance Council. Jonathan joins HAC from his role as Director of Housing, Community Development, and Insurance Policy for the House Financial Services Committee. Prior to that, he served as Managing Director of Federal Policy and Government Affairs at the Low Income Investment Fund, a large national CDFI, and has also worked in senior positions at HUD and in the U.S. Senate. He currently resides near Washington, D.C. with his wife and kids. Leslie Strauss has been at HAC since 1991 and is currently a senior policy analyst. She is responsible for a variety of policy and information activities, including editing the HAC News. Leslie has a law degree and practiced real estate law for several years before joining HAC. She serves on the board of the National Rural Housing Coalition. And now I will hand it over to Jonathan to get us started.
Great, thanks, Dan. Welcome to our briefing on the administration's fiscal year 2023 budget. Just want to make a quick housekeeping note. We're hoping to leave a lot of time for questions, especially since this is likely not the first briefing on the budget many of you have attended. So we'll try to cover our material quickly. That said, we're going to hold questions until the end, but feel free to put them in the chat as they occur to you. Dan, Leslie, and I will track them and we'll create a queue, and time permitting, we'll also open the lines up for more questions. Also, even if you don't have a question for the chat, feel free to drop a note in there to tell us where you're from. I will note that Idaho was first in the House for the webinar. And so let's move forward with the briefing. Leslie, can you advance the slide? Thank you. Well, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then the video that led into the webinar and Dan's description of HAC's work is definitely better than a PowerPoint slide. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, other than to note that HAC has 4 lines of work. And one of the reasons I was so excited to join HAC's policy team at the beginning of this month is because our lending, training, technical assistance, and research all inform our policy agenda. Leslie, could you just advance it? Great. So this is sort of the Civics 101 on how the budget and appropriations process works. Step 1, the president proposes the budget. That happened on March 28th, as Dan noted. It typically happens a little bit earlier, but this is a little bit of an unusual year. And then Congress takes up the appropriations process initially with budget resolutions that are drafted, voted on, and then conferenced in the House and the Senate. And based on that budget resolution known as the 302A, each of the appropriation subcommittees get what's known as their 302B, and then they undertake step 3, which is to draft the appropriations bills and then conference in the House and the Senate. Let me just make a quick note that this is the Civics 101 version of how the appropriations process works. However, absent the situation where you have unified control and 60 votes in the Senate, there's often disagreement about the top line amount, the so-called 302A. So you often have a circumstance in which the Senate and the House appropriations committees and their subcommittees are working toward different numbers and that has to be resolved later in the process. I'm on my 26th federal budget, and I can count on one hand the number of times it's followed exactly like this slide. So what happens if the process fails? Well, you get continuing resolutions, level funding until an Appropriations Act is signed into law, or in the case of each of the instances in which power has changed hands at the first midterm elections after new administration, 1994 and 2010, government shutdowns. I should make one more point because it is relevant to this budget proposal, which is what I've just described describes the discretionary spending process. There is also, in fact, the majority of federal spending is so-called mandatory spending. Mandatory spending programs are created by authorizing or policy committees rather than the appropriations committees. Medicaid and Medicare are well-known examples of mandatory spending programs. So was the proposed Buildback Better Act. Thus, as the discretionary appropriations proposals move through the process I've just described, there is likely also to be a negotiation with authorizing committees on the major mandatory spending proposals that are contained in this budget, which we'll get to shortly. So Leslie, you can advance the presentation and take over.
Leslie, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
I apologize, everybody. I have had that problem with my headset before, so I'm going to just not use it. I was starting to say it's really great to be able to show these slides with big numbers proposed for the next fiscal year. This is the first of a bunch of tables we're going to show you. And it starts right off with quadrupling the funding for the 515 rental housing program. All the numbers, the fiscal 23 budget column is the farthest to the right, and all the numbers are bigger than last year on this particular slide. It's clear from the budget that they want to use 515 funding and 538 guaranteed funding for rental housing preservation, and 514, 516 farm labor housing for new production. But there's also a couple of places where the language references new construction of rental housing under the 515 program. So it appears to be possible that that's contemplated also, and that would be the first time since, I believe, fiscal year 2011 that the 515 program has had enough funding to actually provide new construction. This is not necessarily going to happen. I need to remind you again of that, but this is just what's proposed. The rental assistance number that's shown on this slide includes $6 million set aside for new construction in farm labor housing and in 515 if there is new 515 construction. It also, according to the budget, includes enough money to enable 272,000 existing rental assistance contracts to be renewed. And that includes making permanent the 100,000 worth of new rental assistance contracts that were created under the American Rescue Plan Act. That's about 27,000 units. They were funded. The American Rescue Plan Act was enacted in fiscal 21. It funded them for 21 and 22. So fiscal 23 is the first year that they need to be renewed, those contracts, and USDA intends to renew them all. I hope that the total number stated in the budget for all the contracts that are going to be renewed is supposed to cover all the contracts that need to be renewed. but there are two different numbers in two different places in the budget. So I can't say definitively that every rental assistance contract out there is expected to be renewed, but I think that's the intent. And I'm going to turn it back to Jonathan to talk about preservation at USDA.
Great. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for pointing out that the old phrase for those of us who've done budget lobbying or work of any kind for many years is the president proposes, Congress disposes. So this is a proposal, but it's better to start from a higher number than a lower number. And I'm going to talk more, as Leslie said, about one of HAC's top priorities. I know for many of you is preservation of the multifamily housing stock. As Leslie noted, the $200 million for 515 designated to be used for preservation is a quadrupling of the funding on this table. Very excited to see $75 million for the multifamily preservation and revitalization, or MPR, demonstration program, which is up from $34 million enacted in fiscal year 2022. Taken together, these investments, again, if enacted, would be really important and complementary steps forward in our preservation work, since they have different and important uses. A couple other quick notes here. Small but important programs for all of us: the, rental preservation, technical assistance, not requested. It hasn't been requested in recent budgets, but in several years, Congress has provided that. That's something we will come back to, but it's important to us. And once again, the Preservation Revolving Loan Fund, which has not been funded for a number of years, is also not slated for an increase or for any funding. Let me now turn to, I think, a fairly significant policy proposal by the administration. You see here that 542 rural housing vouchers are $38 million. That is for renewal of existing rural housing vouchers, and it is part of a broader paradigm shift, I think, really, that the administration is looking to do. Their approach to protecting in this budget to protecting tenants and properties where USDA mortgages are ending is to decouple the rental assistance from Section 515 or 514 when a mortgage matures. Currently, as you all know, or many of you, rental assistance is available only if the property has a USDA Section 515 or 514 loan, and if the USDA mortgage ends, the property loses its eligibility for RA. What the administration budget includes legislative language that would allow USDA to continue to offer RA in a property that had it after the mortgage matures, and the decoupled RA contracts would be for 10 to 20 years. This is not a brand new proposal. It's something that's been kicking around the field for some time, but this is the first time that an administration has proposed it. And in fact, actually, the House passed a similar provision in 2019. Couple other key points. The administration is proposing to continue renewing existing Section 8 vouchers. However, the administration includes $20 million in HUD tenant protection vouchers for tenants who previously would have gotten USDA vouchers, USDA rural housing vouchers. And the idea here is to move these tenants to the richer and, in some people's view, more stable subsidy under HUD. We've identified some challenges here, which we can get into at the end as we dive deeper. But As you know, currently, if a USDA property is exiting the program, all tenants of that property, even those who don't currently receive RA, are entitled to rural housing vouchers, and we want to make sure that's the case under the new approach in the HUD budget. The administration of the budget is crystal clear that this is a transitional step to eliminating the 542 rural housing vouchers permanently. And the budget says this budget continues to provide tenant protection against being rent overburdened while transitioning the rural voucher program to HUD. So with that, I will turn it back to Leslie.
I'm actually going to clarify one thing Jonathan said several sentences back, which was you said that they would renew existing Section 8 vouchers. You meant existing Section 542. I trust that HUD is renewing existing Section 8 vouchers also, but in this case, we're talking about the USDA 542s.
Thank you very, very much, Leslie. As you can tell, folks, I've spent much more of my career saying Section 8 and housing choice vouchers than I have rural housing vouchers. Thank you for that correction.
And moving on to single family, we have another slide with bigger numbers shown for this year's budget. There would be increases in single family direct loans, single family guaranteed loans would stay the same. Increases in homeowner repair loans and grants, and in the self-help housing program. This is the program that funds administrative costs of local organizations that run self-help programs around the country. There's another number worth mentioning that is not in the table. 20.8 million for a single family housing direct Native American tribal relending program. I did not make up that title. That's what it says. It's to expand a pilot program that's been working for several years in North and South Dakota, with USDA providing funds to Native CDFIs who can then provide homeownership loans to Native Americans who, as anyone who's worked with homeownership for Native Americans knows, it can be really hard to make that work for a variety of reasons. I also want to mention, before we move away from USDA housing programs, that for both the single family and multifamily programs, USDA would require targeting to projects that improve energy or water efficiency, implement green features, and address climate resilience. We know this is something that's important to this administration, and they're including it in the housing portions of their budget. Quick look at USDA community facilities funding. This looks like there was a big jump in community facilities guarantees in fiscal 22, and then the budget rejected that big jump. I am fairly sure that what that number is earmarks in the 22 appropriations. They are currently called congressionally directed funding, but as you may have heard, for the first time in about 10 years, members of Congress were allowed to direct specific funding towards specific projects in their districts. The USDA rural housing programs were not eligible for earmarks. The community facilities programs were. So there was $183 point something million of earmarks in the CF programs, and I think that's what's showing up in that guarantees line, even though they may not all have been guarantees. And I am going to turn it back to Jonathan.
Great, thank you, Leslie. In terms of housing across the administration's budget, beyond just any single agency, the administration has indicated that had sort of three major goals: increasing the nation's affordable housing supply, I think we're all aware of the shortage of housing across the nation, and also there's a strong evidence that housing costs are actually contributing to the issue of inflation that's been so front of mind. Secondly, looking at expanding rental assistance and increasing its impact on households experiencing homelessness and increasing family mobility, and also addressing climate change is a priority across the budget. I'm going to talk with this slide lays out really sort of the major housing proposal by the administration, which is to increase housing production, and it is spread across two agencies, HUD and the Department of Treasury. HUD has two elements of it: $35 billion, $25 billion in what's known as a housing supply fund. I'm sorry, all $35 billion is referred to as a housing supply fund. $25 billion of that is for flexible funding grants to state and local housing finance agencies and their partners to help streamline the housing finance process, really trying to make it less brain damaging, frankly, to put together affordable housing projects. The other $10 billion is $10 billion in incentive grants, and there have been proposals on this in various forms to incentivize removing barriers to the development of affordable housing, as well as to invest in housing-related infrastructure. And I think we all know, working in rural areas, that water and other infrastructure is absolutely essential to making affordable housing work. As I mentioned, Treasury has a significant role here, including $10 billion in low-income housing tax credit enhancements related to the more generous, related to both the 4% and the 9% tax credit program, and significantly a $5 billion fund at the CDFI fund for grants to CDFIs for innovative housing finance mechanisms. And just to emphasize, again, these are all mandatory funding proposals like the Buildback Better Act was, so they are potentially subject to enactment through reconciliation if the Democratic caucus votes in its entirety in Congress for them. Could I get an advance? Thank you, Leslie. Very significant, I think, for HAC and all of us are a couple key elements of these proposals. First, it focuses on both rental and home ownership, which is very exciting. I think those of us who've spent a lot of our career in housing, there's been too much of the rental versus home ownership, and HAC, of course, works on both rental and home ownership, as do many of you. Secondly, there is a explicit focus on smaller developments that struggle to obtain financing in the current housing finance system, and having a couple of quotes out of it here, noting specifically that rural communities are among those that need projects with smaller development footprints, and mention specifically the kinds of properties that I know many, if not most of you, and certainly HAC work on, 1 to 4 unit properties and multifamily properties below 100 units. And then I would just note finally the broad range of the subsidies that we're looking at. We're looking at tax subsidies. We're looking at both formula and competitive grant funding. And of course, the devil's going to be in the details, but I think one of the important things for anybody who has been on any of the briefings by the administration, whether HUD or by the White House, there's a real focus on what they're calling the one government approach to improving the housing sector. So here's fingers crossed that there will be true coordination and collaboration, and of course we can play a role in encouraging that. Would you mind advancing to the next slide, Leslie? Great. So now, as Leslie said, we got lots of tables for you here, and I'm going to not spend a ton of time on them because these materials, of course, will be available to you. But to get to the second theme that I mentioned, which was rental assistance, as has always been the case historically, the rental assistance programs, both tenant-based rental assistance, more popularly known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and project-based rental assistance are the largest programs at HUD, in significant part because the cost of renewing those vouchers and contracts increases every year, as do housing costs. But as Leslie mentioned, and we've mentioned USDA, what's exciting here is some bold new proposals. Specifically, the administration is proposing 200,000 new vouchers that would be targeted to people experiencing homelessness, families escaping from domestic violence and other vulnerable populations. This would be the largest expansion of the program since its enactment in 1974. $445 million in mobility services to help voucher recipients better deploy their vouchers, including if they want to move to different communities in pursuit of education or employment opportunity. And finally, $50 million to help with conversions under the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. The project-based rental assistance program also increases by over $1 billion, much of that, over half of that, due to just increases in costs of renewing the contracts, but an important nearly $300 million proposal to include make sure that certain FHA-insured multifamily projects that were part of what was known as the mark-to-market program don't fall into distress. And finally, the very important public housing portfolio. We're looking at full funding for both the public housing capital and operating fund, and within the capital fund, a $300 million initiative to increase energy efficiency and climate resilience. That's part of the third theme that I mentioned earlier that cuts across the administration's budget. I think we're ready for the next slide. Great. Here you see the major block grants at HUD, community development block grants, and the home investment partnerships, and the CDBG funding is level funding for the formula grants, but as you can see in fiscal year 2022, the return of congressionally directed spending, or as Leslie noted, popularly known as earmarks, returned with a vengeance in CDBG. I think Leslie was mentioning numbers in the millions in the Community Facilities Fund. We're talking about $1.5 billion in earmarks in fiscal year 2022, and room will have to be found for that, most likely this year. The home program, substantial increase, $450 million as part of the effort to increase housing production. But I would also note for this audience that there's a real effort by the administration to improve and streamline the use of home for down payment assistance, which has been challenging, to say the least, over the past number of years. And that includes a set aside, the amount isn't clear, for down payment assistance for first time and first generation home buyers. So we can go to the next slide. Great. These are a few other critical housing programs. Choice Neighborhoods is receiving essentially level funding, but would note that there's money there to work on brownfields adjacent projects, again, as part of the climate change and environmental elements of the budget. Native American housing, level funding. However, it's important to note that tribes and tribal designated housing entities, or TDHEs, are eligible for the housing supply program I mentioned previously. A significant point is the increase in homeless assistance grants of nearly $500 million. The administration is clearly very focused on addressing homelessness, which has increased particularly for the unsheltered, people experiencing homelessness who are unsheltered. And you can see that reflected here in the homeless assistance grants, including a major bump in the emergency solutions grant program. And thank you. Here, I would just note in these critical programs about level funding, except I will note that for 202 and 811, about 1,000 new units can be expected to be funded in those programs in the coming year if these funding levels are enacted, which is exciting. Significant investment in fair housing, and we can expect that the administration is going to move forward on affirmatively furthering fair housing. They've mentioned that in the context of the budget briefings. And finally, a healthy funding for pun unintended, healthy homes and lead hazard control. Again, a significant part of climate resilience and healthy housing, and a bump in housing counseling funding. So that was sort of the fastest 15 minutes in HUD budget, and I'll turn it back to Leslie.
Just want to point out quickly some of the programs that are in the context of the whole thing, pretty small, but important for HAC and the partners we work with. The Self-Help Home Ownership Program at HUD, better known as SHOP, is proposed to be continued at its past funding level of $10 million. It ended up being a little higher than that for the current year, 22. The Rural Capacity Building Program, which is at HUD, would remain steady at $5 million, and the Rural Community Development Initiative, which is a different sort of capacity building program at USDA, would be doubled. I thought, it would be great if there was some language in USDA's budget about how important capacity building is in rural areas, and they didn't explicitly say that, but the doubling of the budget proposal for that program would seem to indicate that. There are also a couple of other things that aren't on this slide. One is $39 million for the Rural Partners Network, or Rural Partnership Program, called different things in different places, which would be, as Secretary Vilsack explains, a renewed and expanded initiative to leverage USDA's extensive network of county-based offices to help people in high-poverty counties, including energy communities. And there's $3 million for the Rural Placemaking Innovation Challenge, which is a relatively new thing at USDA, in addition to placemaking programs at places, at agencies like the National Endowment for the Arts.
Leslie, before we go on to the next slide, let me just add a couple things if I could. They say in life, timing is everything, and I think I timed my joining HAC very well, in the sense that I get chance to take credit for the great work that HAC's policy team and all of you have done over the last number of months. I just want to note what a significant accomplishment the increase in the SHOP funding in fiscal year 22 was to $12.5 million, and also note that the $12 million for the Rural Community Development Initiative that was proposed in the president's budget, didn't come out of a hat. There was a strong collective effort to educate the administration over the course of the budget formulation process. So I think I just want to acknowledge the work by Leslie and others here, as well as all of you on that. So great. And I will continue by just noting that the funding priorities that HAC has in fiscal year 23 have been just highlighted, really focusing on multifamily housing preservation, particularly MPR and the 515 program, rural capacity building through RCB and the RCDI and the SHOP program, and look forward to working with you on those. I think I'm ready for the next slide here, and encourage all of you. You can go to HAC's webpage. There's a link to our policy priorities, a little more fleshed out than a PowerPoint slide. Hopefully helpful to you. And then next slide. I am going to shamelessly shill for the work that Leslie does as the prime mover of HAC News. Please sign up. It can't be much easier. We've got a QR code here. You can't order your food with it like at a restaurant, but you can get some great HAC News. I encourage people to sign up. And I think that's it. Questions?
Dan, you're muted.
Thank you, Leslie. First, for people who are asking, yes, the session will be recorded. We will be sending out an email to everyone who's attended with a follow-up on an evaluation, and also with the links to view the recording and get to access the PowerPoint and all of those things by the end of the week, if not sooner. And so, yes, people who are looking for a copy of the PowerPoint, absolutely, that will be available. And we're waiting for some questions to come in via chat. We do have some questions that were submitted ahead of time. So while people get ready to ask their questions, I'll ask, what do you expect the timing to be for this year's appropriation process?
Sure, I'll take that unless they can pipe in with sort of the greater knowledge of whether USDA moves differently. But I think we can expect that the House and the Senate will probably move quickly. Usually the House moves first to do what's called marking up their version of the bill in the next few months, and then the Senate will move. Or they may wait, because basically this is not going to be resolved until after the midterm elections, and likely in the new year, and we'll be looking at continuing resolutions. But the House and the Senate will almost certainly want to signal their priorities because this process requires 60 votes. The Senate typically doesn't want to move unless they have some sense of where it may end up. So I think we're going to see sort of normal action in the next couple of months, and then nothing until after the midterms.
And that dovetails nicely into the next question, which is what impact do you anticipate the upcoming midterm elections might have on this process?
Well, elections matter. I think many of us have heard both the sort of the historical trend and where the polling is now that suggests that the party in power and the party of the administration loses seats, particularly in the House and the midterms. And given the thin margins, we are likely looking at split government after the midterms. With at least the House being in Republican control, and as I noted previously, the last two times this happened, there was a government shutdown, which hopefully will not happen. But I think that ultimately a deal on top line spending won't happen until after the midterms, and most likely the top line number will go down from where the president's budget is, and unfortunately, perhaps even from fiscal year 2022.
Okay. And I apologize for a second here. Another question that we had at a time is, what are the prospects for getting additional housing and community development funding through efforts outside the annual appropriation process? So something like the Buildback Better effort.
So I'll address that as well. I think at this point, the administration is at pains to say that their housing production proposal is not a substitute for the Buildback Better Act, which they're trying to revive in some form. However, I would just say that both of those proposals would likely have to pass through what's called the reconciliation process. And that's where sort of, the line between appropriations and non-appropriations and authorizing shifts. As I mentioned, mandatory spending is technically appropriations, but it's enacted through authorizing committees, and you can only really do that once in a congressional session. So I think at some point we're going to look at whether it's this housing production proposal or elements of the proposed Build Back Better Act, that the administration and Democrats in Congress will take one last shot at getting 50 votes in the Senate for a mandatory spending investment in housing. And it's really going to depend on whether Senators Sinema and Manchin are willing to vote for that. And I would just note that based on Senator Sinema has not raised any specific objections around housing, nor has Senator Manchin, but Senator Manchin has mentioned concerns around inflation and around supply issues. And so I think one could see that this production proposal is fairly targeted to those kinds of objections.
Okay, great. We have a question from Larry. 200 million for 515 is great. That first start with a statement. And then, do you know if there are fences around its use? Will RD use it all on NPR backlogs? So 2 questions even.
You go ahead, Leslie. I think you're
okay.
more into this.
The answer is pretty simple. We don't know. It's the budget official document just says 200 million for 515, anything that the 515 program is allowed to do, which could include preservation or new construction, new development. Will RD use it all on NPR backlogs? There is a big jump proposed in the NPR program, which is intended to address a bunch of the backlog. There is an estimate. What did I do with it? I just had it. The budget estimates different amounts actually in different places for what the NPR, this is NPR, not 515 money will do. One place it says it will fully fund 44 projects in the existing 171 project pipeline. In another place, it says it will be for 30 projects with about 1,200 units to be rehabilitated and preserved. So in either event, whether it's 44 projects or 30 projects or even twice as many, it's the pipeline is just huge. It's 171 projects, they're saying. So it's not going to, and the NPR increase is not going to address it all. And I wouldn't be surprised if a chunk of that 515 money is going that way, but it doesn't have to.
Okay. Thank you, Leslie, for that answer. We have one more pre-submitted question. Does the return of earmarks have an impact on housing and community development appropriations?
Yeah, the answer to that is pretty simple, which is yes. Room has to be made for those congressionally directed spending requests, so it can eat into other elements. Last year we got a pretty good budget, but it is a challenge. I think on the positive side, that money is spent on housing and community development, and my experience having worked in the before times when there was congressionally directed spending, that in fact rather really than being the monuments to me or bridges to nowhere that they were criticized for, they tended to follow housing policy, so that if you were in a particular congressional district and there was a permanent supportive housing project or farm worker housing or a project that needed some gap financing, often that would be the subject of a congressionally directed spending. So it's it can be problematic in that it may reduce the overall funding for the authorized programs, but it tends to work as gap financing, for good projects.
I want to jump in to recognize and thank Kelly Cooney from HAC's technical assistance and training staff, who is answering questions in the chat in real time about the RCDI program.
That's how we roll here. We talked about our 4 different lines of work. We're doing 2 of them at the same time.
Right. So that is all the questions that I'm seeing right now. We are able to open it up. If no one wants to type a question, we can open up the microphones. We ask that you select a reaction and choose to raise your hand, like I'm displaying right now, so that you can we can call on you and unmute you. But you can actually unmute yourself. We're just asking you to raise your hand so we can keep some order. So if anyone has questions that they'd like to ask verbally, please go ahead and do so. Oh, and we do have a question that was submitted via chat from Larry. Decoupling rental assistance could be good or bad depending on implementation. Any more detail on how it might work?
It's not, again, there's not a whole lot of detail in the budget. It just includes language that says USDA would have the authority to continue renewing rental assistance contracts in properties that had them before. It's important to note it's not, it would not be providing new rental assistance in places that didn't have it and aren't in the USDA portfolio, but USDA could renew rental assistance contracts in properties that had it before when they leave USDA's portfolio. Yeah,
if I could just, let me just add here, Larry, thanks for the question. I would just say that you know, as you know, this idea of decoupling has been around, for a bit, and everything depends on implementation at this point. HAC is neutral on the concept of implementation, and we look forward, to talking with the administration, understanding where they're coming from, and with stakeholders. Our view has always been that the critical point is both to protect tenants who are current residents of property, but also to maintain affordability. And that's really the function of the mortgage. And as you know, there's sort of been some gymnastics done to amortize mortgages over time so that they're extended. It's really critical that whatever approach is taken, maintains affordability in projects that stay in the program and protects tenants long term for those that leave.
And I think we said this already, but let me say again to be sure that we did. The decoupling would only apply in properties where the mortgage matures. It would not apply in properties that are leaving the portfolio for other reasons.
Oh, wow. That's very helpful. Thanks, guys.
I wondered if that was you.
Yes, it's this, Larry. I'm so afraid that I'm going to mess this thing up that I didn't want to chat, but because my concern is that RD is going to be abandoning communities and making a decision that's not really open for discussion. I've talked about risk ranking, and I've talked about how RD just changed the regs to make incentives discretionary rather than mandatory. So Jonathan, I appreciate that you guys are going to take a measured approach to this, because I think it's going to be in the details, and it's decoupling could be a really good idea, because it would take the burden off that voucher program that RD is just not ever going to be able to fix. But there's just so many rules around it that I hope as a community we're very involved with helping RD figure out a path that would be fair and protect tenants and communities along the way.
The budget does require that for an owner to get it, they have to accept a restrictive use agreement and continue to operate the property under USDA's regs.
Yeah.
So
looking forward to this conversation. I see some other questions, at least one other one queuing up. But I'll just say, having been here for a bit in this world, that I sometimes joke that there are no new ideas in housing. There are only old good ideas and old bad ideas. And unfortunately, there are also good ideas that become bad in the implementation. So we want to avoid that. But Dan, I think I see a couple other good questions in the chat.
Yeah, so it looks like Robin Adams asked, is there any funding available for households earning 80 to 120% of AMI in areas that have high housing costs? And Peter Lawrence already dropped an answer in there, but Jonathan, feel free to expand.
Wait, hold on. Oh boy, I'm gonna have to talk to Peter, because he's stealing my thunder in the chat. But thank you, Robin, for teeing that up. That was a point I realized when you asked the question that I really should have emphasized, which is that there is a broad swath of incomes and a recognition of especially high cost housing areas in the Housing Supply Fund and the Affordable Housing Fund for CDFIs.
And Survey DeBeer adds that USDA's single-family guaranteed loan program serves moderate income families. So does the guaranteed rental program, depending, Robin, on whether you're talking about homeownership housing or rental housing or both. So those are existing programs that can help and the ones Peter and Jonathan are talking about are the new proposals.
And I did want to point out for people that Stephanie Nichols did drop the PowerPoint, a link to the PowerPoint in the chat. So if you scroll up in your chat, you should be able to find it right there. So that is already available. And Tina Dahmer adds that the USDA 502 direct loan assists very low income and low income families with home ownership.
Yeah, we did not try to explain the various programs. We threw out numbers and acronyms and all kinds of information that some of you know and some of you don't. So feel free to ask now or to follow up with us later about some of the specific programs that we talked about and didn't explain. Tina's also pointing out that USDA only functions in areas that meet a certain definition of rural. And to make things more complicated, the new production program, supply fund that's provided, that's proposed at HUD would use a different definition of rural. And the community facilities programs use different definitions of rural. So you always have to check a particular place against the definitions for the programs you want to use, which TA staff can help you do.
Right, it looks like the questions have slowed down and we're almost at the top of the hour. So Jonathan, do you want to say any parting words before we go?
I just want to thank folks for hanging in there for a relatively long PowerPoint and for some great questions, and also thank Leslie for her help and Dan and the rest of the team, and really want to encourage all of you to stay engaged in the process as this moves forward. These are bold proposals. We don't know whether they're going to get to the finish line, but it's really important to engage and talk through these complex challenges and different approaches, and that gives us the best chance for a positive outcome for the field.
Right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Stephanie just dropped a link to an evaluation in the chat. Please do fill that out so we can always keep improving these, making them better. Yeah. And if there are no other questions, thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.